When seasoned FBI agent Jasmine Turner boards a flight under a covert mission to investigate the disappearance of a young woman, she uncovers more than she expected. Racial biases and hidden connections point to a much larger, sinister operation in the sky. As the flight progresses, Jasmine must unravel a dangerous conspiracy before anyone else vanishes. But time is running out, and the people behind the disappearances are closer than she thinks. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Jasmine Turner stood in line at the gate, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces around her. She had done this countless times before, blending into the crowd, wearing the face of an ordinary person while her mind raced with the precision of an FBI agent. But today, it felt different. The stakes were higher, and the weight of the mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her cover was simple: a regular traveler, heading to a distant city for business. In reality, she was investigating the mysterious disappearance of Kara Wilson, a young woman who had vanished without a trace a few months earlier. Kara was last seen boarding a flight operated by this very airline, and Jasmine had reason to believe that the flight crew might hold the key to the case. Today, she was on the same airline with the same crew that worked on Kara's last flight. As she handed her first-class ticket to the gate attendant, she felt the familiar rush of anticipation that came with every new mission. She had chosen to fly in first class, not for comfort, but because it would allow her to observe the flight crew closely. She needed to remain inconspicuous, yet close enough to pick up on any subtle clues. "Enjoy your flight," the gate attendant said, flashing a polite but disinterested smile. Jasmine nodded and stepped through the door. Entering the jet bridge, the hum of the airplane's engines grew louder as she approached the cabin, the air thick with the scent of jet fuel and the faint whir of machinery. She walked calmly toward her seat, scanning the faces of the flight attendants as she passed them by. That's when she saw her, Paige, a tall, blonde flight attendant with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile. Paige looked like the kind of person who had perfected the art of being pleasant to the right people and indifferent to everyone else. As Jasmine settled into her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that Paige was watching her with more scrutiny than she afforded to the other passengers. Moments later, Paige approached Jasmine with a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but tinged with an undercurrent of something more. "I believe you're in the wrong seat. This is first class." Jasmine looked up, her expression calm but firm. "I'm aware," she replied, holding up her ticket.
"I'm supposed to be here." Paige's eyes flickered with surprise for a brief second before her smile returned, a little tighter than before. "My apologies," she said, though there was a certain edge to her voice. "I just wanted to confirm." Jasmine didn't let it bother her. She had encountered this kind of subtle prejudice many times before, being judged not by her qualifications or her actions, but by her appearance. It was a reality she had grown used to, though it never failed to leave a bitter taste in her mouth. As Paige walked away, Jasmine leaned back in her seat and began to take mental notes. This was her first encounter with Paige, and already she sensed that the flight attendant was someone who might let her personal biases affect her professional judgment. It wasn't ideal, but Jasmine wasn't here to make friends. She was here to gather information, and Paige's behavior might be a key part of it. The cabin doors were sealed, and the flight attendants began their pre-flight announcements. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Jasmine's thoughts drifted to the mission ahead. Kara Wilson's disappearance had baffled local authorities. There were no signs of foul play, no suspicious activity in her past. But Jasmine's instincts told her there was something more going on. Something lurking beneath the surface that only someone with the right skills and the right perspective could uncover. Her decision to take this flight was not random. Kara had been on a similar route, with the same crew working her flight. Jasmine suspected that someone on board knew more than they were letting on, and she was determined to find out who. As the plane ascended into the sky, Jasmine kept a watchful eye on the flight attendants. Paige moved with precision, catering to the other first-class passengers with a level of warmth and friendliness that seemed almost excessive. But when she reached Jasmine's row, her demeanor shifted. Her smile faded slightly, her words were shorter, and her body language was less welcoming. It was subtle, but Jasmine noticed it all. Hours into the flight, Paige returned to Jasmine's seat with a tray of refreshments. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" she asked, her voice devoid of the warmth she had offered to the other passengers. "Water, please," Jasmine replied, keeping her tone neutral. As Paige poured the water, her eyes flickered toward Jasmine's carry-on bag, which was neatly stowed under the seat in front of her. For a moment, it seemed as though Paige was trying to piece something together. Perhaps questioning why Jasmine, who appeared out of place in her eyes, was traveling in first class. Jasmine took the water and offered a brief "thank you." But inside, her mind was racing. Paige's behavior was a red flag. In Jasmine's experience, people who harbored biases often let their guard down around those they underestimated. Paige might have information she wasn't even aware of, and Jasmine intended to find out what that was. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing a few passengers to glance nervously at each other. Jasmine remained calm, her mind focused on the task at hand. She had a long flight ahead and plenty of time to observe. As the cabin settled once more, Jasmine's thoughts turned back to Kara. Somewhere, someone knew what had happened to her, and Jasmine was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable realities along the way. This mission wasn't just about solving a case. For Jasmine, it was personal. The prejudice she faced daily, the assumptions people made about her based on nothing more than her skin color, were a reminder that the world wasn't always just. And if she could use her skills to bring justice to those who had been wronged, she would. The flight continued, but Jasmine knew the real turbulence had only just begun. Jasmine sat quietly in her first-class seat, the hum of the plane's engines a constant backdrop to her swirling thoughts. The interaction with Paige lingered in her mind, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it carried weight in the context of her mission. She knew how easily prejudice could cloud judgment and obscure important details. But she had learned, over the years, how to turn that bias to her advantage. People like Paige tended to underestimate someone like her, and that made Jasmine invisible when she needed to be. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the steady, rhythmic movements of the flight attendants keeping the cabin in order. Jasmine observed everything, from the way Paige seemed to skip over her when refilling drinks, to the slightly forced smile she offered to the other passengers. She wasn't just witnessing personal bias, there was something deeper, something about Paige's attitude that made Jasmine suspicious. As the hours passed, Jasmine's mind drifted to the heart of the investigation. Kara Wilson. Kara's face flashed in Jasmine's memory, framed by the photo that had been on her desk for months. She was just 22. Vibrant, full of life. She had been an aspiring artist, her social media filled with sketches and paintings. Then, she disappeared after a flight just like this one, on the same route, with the same airline. Kara had been excited about her trip, as evidenced by her last posts, a vacation to clear her head and focus on her art. But she never made it to her destination. There were no public reports of any suspicious behavior before she boarded, no family or friends who had noticed anything strange in her life. She simply vanished. The flight records showed nothing unusual, and the passengers on that flight were questioned with no results. But Jasmine knew something was off. Cases like this didn't just happen without reason. She had pored over every detail of Kara's life, trying to find any crack in the narrative, any inconsistency that could lead her to answers. But the deeper she looked, the more she realized that the truth wasn't in Kara's past. It was somewhere in the air, floating in the space between departure and arrival. And that's why she was here now, on this flight, retracing Kara's steps. Jasmine turned her head slightly, her eyes locking on Paige, who was at the far end of the cabin speaking to another passenger. From the outside, Paige appeared composed, efficient, even friendly. But Jasmine knew better than to trust surface appearances. She could tell that Paige was hiding something. Maybe not about the investigation directly, but her behavior indicated that she was uncomfortable, guarded. It was an instinct Jasmine had developed after years of working in law enforcement. She could read people, sense their discomfort, and Paige had been radiating unease since the moment Jasmine boarded the plane. Then there was Rachel, another flight attendant Jasmine had noticed. Rachel had a quieter presence, moving through the cabin with the air of someone who had been doing this job long enough to be unnoticed. But Rachel was different from Paige. She didn't share the same attitude. Instead, Jasmine saw flashes of nervousness in Rachel's movements. Small gestures, like how she fidgeted with the edges of her uniform, or how her eyes darted to Paige when she thought no one was looking. Rachel wasn't just nervous, she was afraid. Jasmine had learned to observe these subtleties. They often held the key to unraveling complex cases. Paige might be the one showing open prejudice, but Rachel seemed to be harboring a secret that might be linked to Kara's disappearance. Jasmine's thoughts drifted back to a few nights ago, when she had reviewed Kara's flight itinerary once more. Everything looked normal until she noticed one discrepancy. There was a small gap in the flight records. It wasn't something that would stand out to the untrained eye, but to someone like Jasmine, it was a red flag. The timestamps between certain sections of the flight's crew logs didn't align. It was as if there was a missing piece, something deliberately hidden. And that gap? It involved the crew members, Paige and Rachel. As she sat in her seat, Jasmine discreetly pulled out her phone and checked her notes. There was something about that flight, something she couldn't shake. She had hoped that being on this current flight with the same crew might give her the insights she needed to crack the case wide open. And now, after observing Paige and Rachel for just a few hours, she was convinced she was onto something. Paige passed by Jasmine's seat again, this time to collect empty glasses from the passengers. She glanced at Jasmine briefly, her expression neutral, but Jasmine could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered with something she was trying to hide. "Is everything okay?" Paige asked, her voice polite but lacking genuine concern. "Perfectly fine," Jasmine responded smoothly. Her tone was calm, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that keeping her emotions in check was her greatest weapon. People underestimated calm, and she used that to her advantage. Paige nodded, but her eyes lingered for just a moment too long. She moved on to the next passenger, but the tension between them had grown thicker, more tangible. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, mentally replaying the events of the flight so far. She knew she had to keep a low profile for now. There was no need to tip her hand too early. This wasn't just about investigating Kara's disappearance. It was about understanding the dynamics of the people involved. And something told her that Paige and Rachel were both crucial to the puzzle, just in very different ways. Her mind shifted to the night before the flight, when she had gone over every last detail with her superior, Agent Douglas. He had been clear, this was a covert operation. Jasmine was on her own, no backup, no immediate assistance. She was to gather intelligence, observe, and then make her move when she had enough evidence to bring it all together. But Jasmine had been doing this long enough to know that things rarely went according to plan, and right now, she was operating on instinct as much as fact. The plane jolted slightly as it hit a patch of turbulence. Jasmine barely noticed, her thoughts entirely focused on the investigation. She knew she was getting closer to the truth, but there were still pieces missing, pieces she needed to uncover before the flight ended. Her gut told her that whatever Paige was hiding could be connected to something much bigger than just personal prejudice. As the flight attendants prepared for the meal service, Jasmine's attention remained sharp, watching every movement, every interaction. She wasn't just looking for clues. She was waiting for the moment when things would shift, when the hidden truths would finally come to the surface. In this high-altitude environment, where everyone thought they were safely removed from the problems on the ground, Jasmine knew that the air of secrecy was about to break. And when it did, she would be ready. Jasmine's calm demeanor remained unshaken, but her mind was working at full capacity, piecing together the subtle dynamics unfolding before her. The steady rhythm of the flight continued as if nothing were amiss, but she knew better. Something was off. Her years in the FBI had trained her to detect the smallest irregularities, and this flight, its crew and their behavior, was now deeply unsettling. As the meal service began, she noticed how Paige continued to treat her with a distinct coldness, offering only the bare minimum in terms of service. Meanwhile, other passengers received warm smiles and an easygoing rapport. It was clear to Jasmine that Paige didn't see her as an equal, and this bias might blind her to the real danger that lurked in the background. But Paige's behavior wasn't the only thing keeping Jasmine on edge. There was Rachel, the nervous flight attendant whose anxiety seemed to grow more palpable as the flight wore on. Rachel's unease couldn't be entirely explained by the natural stress of working a high-pressure job. Jasmine could sense that there was something Rachel was hiding, something that went far beyond the day-to-day concerns of a flight crew. Jasmine kept a discreet eye on Rachel, watching as she moved quietly through the cabin, avoiding unnecessary interactions with passengers. The way Rachel fidgeted when Paige was nearby, the constant checking of her watch, and the way her hands shook ever so slightly as she served drinks, these were all signs that Rachel was under immense stress. Jasmine had seen these behaviors before, in people who were involved in something far bigger than they could handle. The meal service finished, and the lights in the cabin dimmed as the plane settled into the long-haul portion of the flight. Most passengers were content to relax or sleep, but Jasmine's investigation was just beginning. She reached down to her bag, pretending to adjust something inside, while her eyes continued to scan the cabin. It was time to start gathering intelligence. Jasmine knew she couldn't overtly question the crew without raising suspicion. But there were other ways to gain information, ways that wouldn't draw attention to her. Her first opportunity came when Paige moved to the galley at the back of the cabin, leaving Rachel alone in the aisle. Jasmine seized the moment. She rose from her seat, stretching as if she were simply going for a walk, and made her way toward the back of the plane. As she passed Rachel, she made eye contact, offering a small, non-threatening smile. "Excuse me," Jasmine said softly, careful to keep her tone casual. "Could I get some water?" Rachel, startled by the request, nodded quickly. "Of course," she said, her voice shaky as she turned toward the galley to retrieve a bottle. Jasmine watched her carefully, noting the nervous way Rachel handled even the simplest tasks. As she handed Jasmine the water, Rachel avoided direct eye contact, her gaze flicking nervously toward the back of the cabin where Paige had disappeared. "Thanks," Jasmine said, keeping her voice light as she took the bottle. But instead of returning to her seat, she lingered for a moment. "Busy flight, huh?" Rachel's eyes widened slightly, and she hesitated before responding. "Yes, it's been pretty busy." "You've been doing this for a while, right?" Jasmine asked, keeping her tone conversational. She could see that Rachel was on edge, and pushing too hard too soon would make her clam up. She needed to build trust. Rachel nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "A few years." Jasmine took a sip of the water, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I couldn't help but notice something earlier, that gap in the crew logs between Kara's flight and now." "What happened?" Rachel's face drained of color, and her eyes darted around the cabin, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Her hand tightened around the tray she was holding. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her reaction confirmed what Jasmine had suspected. Rachel knew something. Jasmine's expression softened, and she took a step closer, lowering her voice even further. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Rachel. I'm here to find out what happened to Kara. That's all." Rachel's breath hitched at the mention of Kara's name, and for a moment, it looked as if she might break. But just as quickly as the crack appeared, Rachel shut it down, her face hardening as she took a step back. "I'm sorry, but I really can't talk about that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't ask me again." Before Jasmine could press further, Paige reappeared, her expression immediately turning suspicious as she saw the two women standing so close together. "Is everything all right here?" Paige asked, her tone sharp as she looked between Rachel and Jasmine. "Everything's fine," Jasmine replied smoothly, her calm demeanor never faltering. "Just needed some water." Paige's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything more. Rachel quickly retreated, hurrying back to the galley, clearly eager to escape the tension. Jasmine returned to her seat, her mind racing. Rachel knew something important, Her reaction to Kara's name had been telling, and Jasmine was certain that Rachel was involved, either directly or indirectly, in whatever had happened to the missing woman. But Rachel was terrified, and that fear wasn't just coming from the usual stress of withholding information. No, there was something more. Someone had silenced Rachel. And it wasn't just a sense of loyalty to her job. It was fear. Fear of what would happen if she spoke out. As the flight continued, Jasmine's thoughts turned back to the investigation. There had been no traces of Kara after her last flight, no clues left behind that pointed to her whereabouts. The authorities had combed through her life, her social circles, and her habits, but nothing had led to any concrete answers. That's when the FBI had been called in, and Jasmine had taken over the case. The first thing Jasmine had done was follow the trail to this airline. She had learned early on that the simplest explanations were often the correct ones, but this case was anything but simple. The flight Kara had taken was routine, uneventful, except for the fact that she had disappeared afterward. And now Jasmine was flying on the same route, with the same crew, hoping to uncover what everyone else had missed. Paige's behavior, Rachel's fear, and the unexplained gap in the crew logs. They were all pieces of a puzzle Jasmine was determined to solve. But there was something else gnawing at the back of her mind, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The more she observed, the more she sensed that this case wasn't just about Kara. There was something bigger at play, something that went beyond a single missing woman. Jasmine's instincts were rarely wrong, and right now, they were screaming at her to dig deeper. She had uncovered enough to know that Rachel was involved in some way, but Paige remained a wild card. Jasmine knew that if she was going to crack this case open, she needed to get Paige to slip up. It was only a matter of time before the flight attendant's biases and hidden secrets would catch up with her. The plane jolted slightly as it passed through another patch of turbulence, but Jasmine barely noticed. Her focus was now entirely on the next steps of her investigation. The clock was ticking, and she needed to gather enough evidence before they landed. There was no room for error. Jasmine sat back, her mind racing with possibilities. The investigation was no longer just about Kara. It was about unraveling the hidden truths that were now dangerously close to the surface. And when those truths came to light, Jasmine knew that nothing would ever be the same. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the seats as most passengers settled in for the overnight portion of the flight. The hum of the engines had become a steady, rhythmic lull, but Jasmine's mind was far from restful. Her encounter with Rachel had only intensified her resolve. Rachel was holding something back, something critical, but she was too scared to speak openly. And Paige's prejudices and sharp attitude were hiding a darker truth. Jasmine could feel it in her gut. As the minutes ticked by, Jasmine's attention sharpened. She needed a way to dig deeper without blowing her cover. Time was running out, and she was keenly aware that the flight wouldn't last forever. Soon, they would land, and she would lose her opportunity to gather intelligence from the crew. With a calculated move, she stood from her seat once more, making her way toward the restrooms near the back of the plane. She had already noted that this was where the flight attendants gathered when they weren't attending to passengers. As she approached, she overheard hushed voices coming from the galley. She slowed her pace, her ears trained on the conversation ahead. "I'm telling you, we have to be careful," Rachel's voice whispered, her tone laced with anxiety. "I've told you before, just keep your mouth shut. You don't want to end up like her, do you?" Paige's voice responded, colder and sharper than Jasmine had ever heard before. There was an edge to her words that sent a chill down Jasmine's spine. Rachel's reply was barely audible. "But—" "No buts," Paige snapped. "We've got this under control. We've been over this 100 times. Stick to the plan, and everything will be fine. Just remember what happened last time. We can't afford any mistakes, especially not now." Jasmine froze, her pulse quickening. They were talking about Kara. There was no doubt in her mind now. Paige and Rachel were involved, deeply involved. The flight crew had something to do with Kara's disappearance, and now they were trying to cover it up. But what had Rachel meant when she said last time? And what did Paige mean by not wanting to end up like her? The vague references were haunting, but they confirmed what Jasmine had suspected all along. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too enclosed. Jasmine's training kicked in. She couldn't confront them now, not yet. She needed to gather more evidence, get something concrete that she could use to blow the case wide open. Turning her back on the galley, she returned to her seat, her mind racing. As Jasmine sat down, her eyes flicked toward her carry-on bag, where her encrypted phone was tucked safely inside. It was her lifeline to the FBI, her only means of communication with Agent Douglas. But she couldn't use it here. The plane was too exposed, and any signal she sent would immediately raise suspicion. She had to wait, had to be patient. Another hour passed, the tension in the cabin thick enough to cut through. Paige and Rachel moved through the aisles, but their interactions were strained. It was clear to Jasmine that the two flight attendants were on edge. Whatever they were involved in, it was about to come crashing down on them, and Jasmine intended to make sure of it. As Paige passed by, Jasmine seized the moment. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. Paige stopped, her eyes narrowing. "Yes?" Jasmine held her gaze, her words carefully chosen. "I just wanted to thank you for the hospitality. I wasn't sure what to expect on this flight, but it's been illuminating." Paige blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the cryptic remark. She quickly recovered, her professional mask slipping back into place. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, but her tone lacked the warmth it might have held for other passengers. Jasmine could see the tension in Paige's shoulders, the subtle shift in her posture as she turned to walk away. Paige knew. Jasmine's presence was no longer just an annoyance to her. It was a threat, and the cracks in Paige's facade were starting to show. As Paige moved away, Jasmine's mind worked furiously. She was close, so close to the truth. But she needed a catalyst, something that would force Paige or Rachel to reveal more. Something that would push them over the edge. Her chance came not long after, when the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The lights flickered briefly, and the cabin shuddered as the aircraft was jostled by unseen forces. Most of the passengers were startled, clutching the armrests of their seats, but Jasmine remained calm, her mind already thinking ahead. As the turbulence passed, Jasmine noticed something that set her instincts on high alert. Paige, who had been standing near the front of the cabin, glanced toward Rachel with a look of unmistakable fear. It was fleeting, but it was enough. Rachel's face was pale, her hands trembling as she struggled to maintain her composure. Something was happening, something neither of them had anticipated. Suddenly, Rachel disappeared toward the back of the plane. Her steps hurried. Jasmine knew this was her chance. She stood, moving quickly but quietly toward the rear of the plane. She found Rachel in the galley, her back to Jasmine, as she leaned against the counter, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Rachel?" Jasmine said softly but with authority. Rachel spun around, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing back here?" "I know," Jasmine said, keeping her voice low but firm. "I know about Kara, and I know you're scared, but you don't have to be. I can help you." Rachel's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not just me. It's—" "Then tell me," Jasmine urged, stepping closer. "Tell me the truth, and I promise I'll protect you. But we're running out of time, Rachel. Whatever you know, you need to tell me now." Rachel hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting Paige to walk in at any moment. Her fear was palpable, but so was her desperation. She was on the edge, torn between her loyalty to Paige and her need to escape whatever nightmare she was trapped in. Finally, Rachel's shoulders slumped and she nodded, her voice barely audible. "It's not just Kara," she whispered. "There have been others. They disappear after these flights, always young women, always alone. Paige knows. She's involved, but she's not the one in charge. It's bigger than her." Jasmine's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It wasn't just Kara. This was part of something much larger, a hidden operation that had been going on under the radar for months, maybe even years. "Who's behind it?" Jasmine asked, her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. Rachel shook her head, her eyes filled with terror. "I don't know. I've never seen them. Paige, she's the one who arranges things, but she takes orders from someone else. I don't know who they are, but they control everything." Jasmine's mind raced as she processed Rachel's words. This was bigger than she had imagined. Kara wasn't just a random victim. She was part of a pattern, part of something far more sinister. And now, Jasmine was dangerously close to exposing it all. But before she could ask anything more, Paige appeared at the end of the aisle, her eyes locking onto Rachel and Jasmine. Her face twisted into a mask of anger and fear. "What are you doing?" Paige snapped, striding toward them. Jasmine turned to face Paige, her expression calm, but her mind already preparing for the confrontation that was coming. She had the information she needed, but now she had to survive long enough to use it. "I was just having a conversation," Jasmine said, her voice measured. "But it seems like you have a lot more to say." Paige's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Jasmine saw the true danger lurking behind the flight attendant's carefully constructed exterior. This wasn't just about prejudice or bias anymore. This was about survival, for both of them. The tension in the air was thick as Paige closed the distance between herself and Jasmine. There was no trace of the polished, professional flight attendant now. Her expression was cold, dangerous. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink around the three women, the rest of the plane and passengers fading into the background. It was just them, locked in a battle of will and knowledge, and Jasmine knew she had to act fast before things spiraled out of control. "Step away, Rachel," Paige commanded, her voice low but filled with a simmering threat. Rachel stood frozen, torn between fear and the guilt that had been gnawing at her since Kara's disappearance. Her eyes darted between Paige and Jasmine, but it was clear she was close to breaking down completely. She had crossed a line by confessing to Jasmine, and now she was teetering on the edge of betrayal. Jasmine, calm and composed, took a step forward, placing herself protectively between Paige and Rachel. She couldn't afford to let Rachel back down now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. "Paige, it's over," Jasmine said, her voice steady and unwavering. "Rachel's already told me everything. You can't hide this anymore." Paige's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Jasmine with a mix of fury and desperation. For a moment, Jasmine thought Paige might lash out physically, but she held herself in check. There was too much at stake for her to lose control now. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Paige hissed. "You're just a passenger. You think you can waltz in here and make accusations? You don't know anything." But Jasmine did know. She had pieced together enough from Rachel's confession, and her instincts had been right from the start. This wasn't just about Kara. It was about a string of disappearances, all connected to this flight crew. And Paige was at the center of it. "You've been covering up disappearances for months, maybe longer," Jasmine said, her voice growing more authoritative. "I know about Kara, but she wasn't the only one. You and whoever's giving you orders have been targeting vulnerable women, young, alone. You think you've been careful, but you've slipped up." Paige's face paled slightly, though she kept her expression hard. The flicker of fear in her eyes was all Jasmine needed to confirm that she was on the right track. Paige had been careful, but she hadn't anticipated someone like Jasmine, a trained investigator, being on her flight. Jasmine pressed on, her voice low but intense. "Rachel told me enough. She's afraid of you, but she's even more afraid of whoever's pulling the strings. I'm giving you one chance to come clean. Tell me who's behind this, and maybe I can help you." For a moment, Paige seemed to waver, the mask slipping from her face as the enormity of the situation weighed down on her. She was caught, and she knew it. But there was still a dangerous glint in her eyes, a determination that told Jasmine she wasn't ready to give up just yet. "Help me?" Paige scoffed, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You can't help me. No one can. I'm just doing what I'm told." Rachel, who had been standing silently behind Jasmine, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "Paige, please, it's over. We can't keep doing this. We can't keep covering it up." Paige whipped around, her eyes blazing with anger. "Shut up, Rachel. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what they'll do to us if we don't follow through." Rachel's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't take it anymore. I don't want to be part of this. I didn't sign up for this." Jasmine seized the opportunity. "Rachel's right, Paige. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the lives you've destroyed, the people who've gone missing. The FBI is already onto this, and they'll dig until they find every last person involved. Do the right thing now, and maybe you can save yourself from the worst." Paige's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting wildly as she weighed her options. Jasmine could see the conflict raging inside her. The fear of what would happen if she cooperated versus the fear of what might happen if she didn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Paige's shoulders slumped and she exhaled shakily. "I don't know their names," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only know the contact I deal with. A man. He's never given me a name, just instructions. I don't know where the women go or what happens to them after they disappear. My job is to identify the targets, get them on the right flight, and then they're gone." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces fell into place. This was a trafficking ring, and Paige was one of the key players in the operation. But even Paige didn't know the full scope of what she was involved in. She was just a cog in a much larger, more sinister machine. Paige looked up at Jasmine, her eyes hollow, defeated. "I didn't want this," she muttered. "I didn't want any of this, but once I was in, there was no way out. They threatened me, my family. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Jasmine replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "You chose to stay silent, and because of that, people like Kara have suffered. But you can still make a different choice now." For a moment it seemed as if Paige might break down, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'll tell you everything I know," she said, her voice tight. "But it won't be enough. They'll find someone else to take my place. You can stop me, but you won't stop them." Jasmine nodded. She knew that Paige was right. This operation went far beyond one person, far beyond one flight crew. But Paige's confession would be the first step in dismantling the ring, and that was enough for now. Jasmine took out her phone, preparing to send a discreet message to Agent Douglas. "You did the right thing," she said quietly, looking at both Paige and Rachel. "It's not too late to make amends." Rachel nodded, relief flooding her expression. But Paige remained stiff, her face unreadable. Within moments, the plane's landing gear began to descend, signaling that they were approaching their destination. Jasmine felt a surge of adrenaline as she sent the encrypted message to her team, detailing everything she had learned. They would be waiting when the plane landed, ready to apprehend Paige and begin the process of taking down the larger network. The descent was quick, and Jasmine's mind raced with the implications of everything that had just unfolded. Kara's disappearance had been the catalyst, but this operation was far bigger than one missing woman. Jasmine's investigation had uncovered a web of lies, deceit, and exploitation that stretched far beyond this single flight. But now, the truth was coming to light. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Jasmine glanced over at Paige, who was sitting quietly, her hands clenched in her lap. There was no more anger, no more defiance, just resignation. When the plane came to a stop, Jasmine stood, gathering her things as the other passengers prepared to disembark. She kept a close eye on Paige, knowing that the FBI agents would be waiting just outside the gate to take her into custody. As Jasmine made her way toward the exit, Rachel caught her arm, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jasmine nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "It's not over yet, but you've taken the first step. That's what matters." Rachel gave a tearful nod, stepping aside as Jasmine exited the plane. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped into the terminal, and just as she expected, Agent Douglas and his team were waiting. "Good work, Turner," Douglas said, his expression serious but approving. "We'll take it from here." Jasmine nodded, watching as the agents moved in to detain Paige and secure the scene. It was far from the end, but it was a start. Justice would be served, and Kara's disappearance, along with so many others, would not be in vain. As Jasmine walked away from the terminal, the weight of the case still heavy on her shoulders, she couldn't help but reflect on the deeper message this investigation had revealed. Prejudice, power, and fear had allowed this operation to thrive, hidden in plain sight. But now it was exposed, and those responsible would face the consequences of their actions. Jasmine took a deep breath, the weight of karma heavy in the air. The truth had been unveiled, and the people who thought they could operate in the shadows would soon find themselves in the harsh light of justice. The flight was over, but the impact of what had been uncovered would ripple far beyond the confines of the plane. In the end, no one could escape the consequences of their choices, not even those who believed they could hide forever. Jasmine sat in her office weeks later, reading the final report on the case. The trafficking ring had been dismantled, and Paige, along with several others, was facing serious charges. Rachel had cooperated fully, and her testimony would be crucial in bringing the entire operation to justice. Kara's family had finally received some closure, though the pain of her loss would never fully heal. But knowing that justice had been served brought them some measure of peace. For Jasmine, the case had been a reminder of the power of persistence and the importance of uncovering hidden truths, no matter how deeply buried they were. And as she closed the case file, she knew that while this battle had been won, there would always be more to fight. But she was ready. Justice, after all, never rested. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.